Today, I'm with Beau Newell, National Programme Manager of Pride Sport Australia, an Australian-first sporting inclusion programme specifically designed to assist sporting organisations at all levels with the inclusion of employees, athletes, volunteers, officials and spectators with diverse sexualities and genders. In a world first, the Pride in Sport Index, PSI, is the first and only benchmarking instrument specifically designed to assess the inclusion of people with diverse sexualities and genders. Now, Beau's knowledge and understanding of the sporting landscape is extensive. In the years leading up to the marriage equality debate, Beau and his partner pioneered the LGBTQ rights advocacy in regional and rural New South Wales, becoming a spokesperson for many outspoken LGBTQ individuals in regional Australia, which led Beau being nationally recognised for his contribution for his LGBTQ advocacy and at the Australia's Honour Awards, which must have been pretty special. Now, for anybody that knows Beau, he's a staunch advocate for human rights, and I'm really pleased to be able to welcome you to this session of Part of the System. How are you going, Beau?
I'm great. Awesome to be here. Thanks for inviting me, David.
Oh, thanks for jumping on and talking to us. And did I pronounce your name right? Because I know that's this strange northeastern English accent that I've got.
All will be forgiven, David. That's not a problem at all. No, that's fine. I've been called lots of things, and the way you pronounce that is not an issue for me. So
that's good. And where are you coming from today?
So I'm coming to you from a Wabakal country in New South Wales. So that's Newcastle, New South Wales, for anyone who doesn't know.
Yeah, awesome. Obviously not the Newcastle in England.
Very different.
All right, well, we'll jump straight in. So what does well-being mean to you?
Oh, look, I don't like doing the dictionary definitions, David, but look, I think for anyone, or for me personally, it's just about making sure that I'm at peace with myself. And I know that sounds a little bit soppy in some ways, but the idea that, you look after yourself, you look after your physical health as much as what you do your mental health, or at least you should.
Yeah.
And so I try to live that focus as much as I can, and that's, I look after myself, make sure that I give myself adequate breaks, in the idea of, you work hard, you play hard, you need to enjoy your life, because at the end of the day, we only live once, don't we? So.
Well, we don't quite know that yet, do we? We only live once, but it's. I actually love the fact that you're saying work hard, play hard. So, what are some of the things that you do to play then to look after your well-being?
So not a lot of people know this, but I'm actually married. So I've got a husband, been married for over a year now, but we've been together for almost 10.
Congratulations.
And we've also got two kids,
Wow.
Two boys. They're twin boys. They're just turned 4 years old. So as you can probably imagine, most of my spare time at the moment is chasing them around the house, chasing them around the park. But look, I love it. I enjoy the idea of getting away as much as I possibly can with the kids. Taking them to the park, going and exploring things, and I guess in a way sort of seeing things from their perspective once again, which I haven't done for a long period of time. So a lot of my time spent with the kids at this point in my life. But aside from that, we play a few different sports here or there, just socially for a bit of fun with our friends. We like to travel, probably more domestic at the moment than international, but hey, that's life, isn't it?
Yeah, it absolutely is at the moment. But it sounds like a really special time in your life then, with bringing up these boys, and just obviously just 1 year married. So that's really nice to hear, because I know you're very busy in terms of all the things that you do, and you're obviously doing some fantastic work around inclusion. And where does that passion come from for supporting people? If you just give us a little bit of insight there.
Yeah, it's a really good question. I would love to say, and probably for the most part, I think it's the way that I was brought up. I like to say that, my upbringing and the way my parents raised me was a real key contributor to the way that, I express myself and, I live my life currently. But I think also an element of, the lived experience. So growing up as a young kid who was coming to terms with their sexual orientation, it was, look, for me, it was actually probably good comparatively, but at the time, it was mixed emotions in that, I had some good moments and I had some bad. I still think back to, different times in high school where, people would use different homophobic slurs to call me names. And I wasn't out to people at that stage. And I was, like I said, still trying to come to terms with exactly who I was. So it was a confusing part of my life. And as I got older, and as I got more involved in different things like sport, for example, I realized that, as the saying sort of goes, things do get better. But I think a lot of that for me has actually been because of, different leaders and different advocates that have, led the way in, for lack of a better phrase, in that, so many people have been able to achieve so much in their life in trying to get more equal rights for the LGBTQ community. Even to the point where, like, I met my now husband, and we lived in regional New South Wales for a while, and I think you alluded to it in your intro. And when we're having the marriage equality debate in Australia, I guess, like a lot of people, when we moved out west, we had this sort of stereotype that, anyone who lived in the country or anyone who lived bush were bogans, and they wore cowboy hats and, plaid shirts. And that was just far from the truth, in that it was such an inclusive space. We've made so many lifelong friends from living there. But I guess there was still this inherent perception that, being gay was less than, in a way. And a lot of that actually came to light during the marriage equality debate, in that, when we moved out there, it was at the height of, the talks of plebiscite happening, and people across the country having their say. And at least from my perspective, there wasn't enough conversation happening in our region, in our electorate at the time, about, why people should be voting yes. So me being me, I just thought, well, if no one else is going to say anything, I will. And cut a long story short, we started speaking a little bit more publicly. We created some social media accounts that got people involved in, I guess, advocating for their family and their friends who were out. And we started getting radio interviews, TV interviews. I love the fact too that when we started a lot of our campaigning, our member for parliament at that point in time was a staunch advocate against marriage equality. And he had this perception, or this belief that we met him one day, and he said, oh, surely I don't have any more than 10, maybe 15% of people in my electorate that would vote yes. And we're kind of gobsmacked at that thought, that, that he had that in his mind. And I like to think that I played a little bit of a part in his retirement, because when the vote came out, I think it was between 60 and 70% that voted yes. Wow. And shortly after that, he announced his retirement. So I'm taking that as a victory.
That's huge. That's huge. And I'm really interested to hear what made you feel that you needed to do what you did, because there's a lot of obviously gay, bisexual, etc. people out there, and but everybody doesn't I suppose stand up for it or be an advocate for whatever reason. So what was the thing that made you change and do what you did there?
I probably couldn't narrow it down to one particular thing, but something that stands out in my mind, David, was when my partner and I were doing that advocacy in regional rural areas. To a bit of context here. So my partner's a school teacher, and when we started to get radio and TV interviews, something went through me, and I like to think that I was just trying to be protective, but it was a lot of ignorance in a way, in that I kind of said to my partner, maybe I should do the radio and TV interviews so that you're not persecuted or bullied as a teacher at school, still being relatively new to that area.
And that wasn't just because you're better at that stuff.
No, not at all. No. Just he might say differently, but no, that's not the case at all. But look, it was like I said, it's ignorance. And I say that in hindsight now because I was ignorant to the fact that, he was not only just as capable, if not better at public speaking than what I was. But I neglected to think about, the impact that he would have on people in his life. And that I knew, or at least I thought, that if I spoke up, I could speak and try and create a more inclusive environment for younger people involved in sport, for example. But it wasn't until we eventually did an interview together, but my partner and I, and shortly after that, when he went to school, he had a young student come up to him and say, "I saw you on TV the other day. I just want to let you know that I'm not out to my family and friends, but you're the reason I want to start being more brave, and I'm going to start coming out to people." And that's who I went. And like, I'm getting emotional even just thinking about that. In the idea that, it's those sort of experiences. It's just by, having a quick 10-second grab on a TV, news show, made the difference for at least that young person. And I have no doubt plenty more that just felt more comfortable, more confident with who they are. So to kind of go back to your original question, for me, it's about making sure, the environment that I grew up in doesn't happen for younger generations. And I like to think that's not the case. I like to think things are a lot better than they are now. Still a long way to go, but from my perspective, things are changing for the better.
Yeah. Sorry about this going back and forth. I hope it's not disturbing you. I'm just in a cafe. But reflecting on what you're saying there, but is there anything better than that, than giving somebody the encouragement and confidence to be open about who they are or what they believe in? I think that's amazing. In the work that you're doing.
Absolutely. No, I couldn't think of anything better. I mean, if we can create a space that people are comfortable expressing who they are and articulating who they are, using the language that they like, and just genuinely being themselves, then that's a win. Like, that's a gold medal in my book.
Yeah, absolutely. And that gold medal links us in nicely to Pride in Sport Australia and the fantastic work that you guys are doing. So what could you tell us a little bit more about how you see Pride in Sport Australia, fit into the health and wellness system in Australia?
Yeah, so like, for those who don't know, and I think you said at the start, like, we work with quite a lot of sporting bodies across the country, and I like to think that we're an influencer for one, and we're an innovator, and that we try to make and help organisations think differently about inclusion and diversity, and that it doesn't need to be an add-on piece of work that they do. It's something that we need to incorporate in our day-to-day lives and our day-to-day work. I think in terms of the health and well-being component, I mean, for me, that's just a given, and that's where we're as much about diversity inclusion as we are about primary prevention, in the idea of, preventing, the negative impacts that come with homophobia and biphobia and transphobia, for example. And I think one good example of that came from a piece of work that we did last year with a handful of national sporting bodies. And we weren't necessarily, or I like to think that we weren't, but we probably were to a degree, but we weren't necessarily the driver in a lot of this work. That the sports developed their own transgender inclusion governance. So some did community guidelines, some did elite policies. And my perspective of that is that, we were in some ways the conduit between, the sporting bodies themselves and the community that they're trying to be more inclusive of. And for me, I've heard so many stories just from that one particular initiative of sports, delivering their respective inclusion policies for trans and gender diverse individuals, about people coming out and saying that they feel so much more welcome and accepted in their sport. Or, the amount of people that have contacted me since then, who are trans, and said that they played sport as a young boy, but now that they're an older woman, they didn't feel like they could play in sport. But because of what we've done and been able to do with the sports, they now have the confidence to go to their local club and ask the question to say, "Hey, can I play?" It's those sort of experiences that I think are quite often underestimated, in the fact that, what I've just mentioned is a lot about policy, right? So, and a lot of the work that we do is around policy, but the impact that that has on the health and well-being of any individual, and in that particular scenario, quite a lot of individuals within the trans community, was overwhelmingly positive. And like I said, quite a lot of the feedback and the commentary that we got was wonderful. But even to the point now where we've got more than I can count on one hand, in terms of national sporting bodies coming to Pride and Sport and saying, "Hey, we want to do the same thing. We want to open our doors. We want to be inclusive." And I think one aspect of that journey for the sports is almost like a realization in the idea that every sport wants more members. Who doesn't want more members? Who doesn't want more volunteers? But I think for a lot of them, it's a wake up call is probably not the right phrase, but almost that shake up a little bit to move away from the ignorance and the naivety to understanding the facts, and that we're all naive in that we all believe, or we all like to think, that we come from an inclusive sport. And I have this conversation with CEOs in particular on a regular basis, in that, is your sport inclusive, or do you think your sport's inclusive? And their response back is straight away yes. But the reason why they say yes is quite often because, they've either never had a disciplinary matter that relates to an LGBTQ related incident, or the fact that they've got a gay player that plays in their representative teams, or they've got a gay board member, and because those people are involved, then obviously that means we're inclusive. Or even down to the point where people believe that just by putting a rainbow flag on their front door means that they're an inclusive environment. And while all of those are amazing things in their own right, that's not proving that an organization is inclusive. So there's a lot more to it than that. But now I think I probably haven't even answered your question. But
No, you have. And I think for me, it's what's coming across is that, with the sporting bodies and all these organizations you're working with, if they're not going to get on board, they're going to get left behind because
yeah, absolutely.
it's not just good for participation and memberships, but it's also, it's about the culture and providing safe spaces and, and environments for people to play, no matter, what your background or, whether it's, your sexual orientation or whatever, it shouldn't matter. We're all humans. And I would imagine.
That's right. And how many sports have the phrase, we're a sport for all? I mean, I can't even think now, but I know there's so many across Australia that have a phrase like that or similar to that, where they're trying to say that, they're inclusive of everyone. But if you actually dive into it and dive down to the intricacies of different diverse communities in the country, the reality is they're probably not. And in the terms of maybe they're not doing everything they possibly can to be more inclusive for the trans community, for people who are gay or lesbian or bi. Even for that matter, people from multicultural backgrounds, Indigenous backgrounds, women, youth, the elderly. We all, like I said, we all like to think that we come from an inclusive environment and inclusive sport. But the reality is, whether we like it or not, and I certainly don't, sport in Australia is inherently homophobic. And I don't say that lightly, and I don't say that to be insultive by any means, but that's just the reality of, the world that we've grown up in. So now it's time for the sports to really, I guess, walk the walk. They've talked the talk for such a long period of time, and we've had plenty of conversations across nearly every sport in this country about how we can be more inclusive. I guess that's one of the roles that Pride and Sport like to play, is making sure that, that the sports have the proof in the pudding, that if they say that they're inclusive, we'll hold them accountable to that.
I do find it really interesting there. You mentioned about sports and particularly around homophobia, and obviously from the UK, and football used to be a big part of my life, and the same could be, you could put this concept with AFL or rugby league, and the fact that players don't, there's not a lot of players that come out, and when you think about the statistics around people and their different sexualities, how do you think we can shift that for people to feel more open to be able to do it. Because I know in England, you can be lethal on them terraces with people, with fans shouting abuse at you and things. It's terrible.
Oh,
Makes you think about it,
absolutely.
as human beings, what are we like, really? Like when you can be so nasty to people. But that's a reality of
Well,
the.
yeah, exactly. And I think that's a really good point in that, there's a piece of research that was published in 2015 called Out in the Fields. And one of the stats within that say that 75% of people believe that an openly gay person would not be safe as a spectator at a sporting event. And like that's scary in its own right. And the reality is that stat hasn't actually changed that much over the last 5 to 6 years. But to your point about, I guess the idea of what is it that sports can do in this space, it's going to be different for every single one of them. I think there's an element of, sports need to be able to address areas like policy and governance and all the boring stuff that we quite often talk about. But there's, I mean, if I look at the Pride and Sport Index, for example, there's key components within that address policy, governance, leadership, community engagement, education. Education in particular is so important in this space. Hearing from people, hearing their personal experiences, learning what the research tells us. And like to your point before about, I guess this inherent idea that, there's not enough out people in sport. While there's a partial truth to that, I think it's also important to acknowledge the fact that we're not encouraging sports to do work in this space purely to make people come out of the closet. Like, while yes, that would be amazing, don't get me wrong. I guess there's another element to that in that, we've got to think about it from the individual's perspective. And I share this example sometimes in that, think of it from the shoes of a young 14-year-old boy who plays in a team sport. He's coming to terms with his sexuality, for example, and he's afraid. He's afraid that if he comes out to his teammates, they might bully him, harass him. Add an extra layer to that. He's now worried that if he comes out to some of his teammates, what if one of those teammates tell his coach? How is that going to impact his, selection for, the next rep team? Add another layer to that. He might not be out to anyone in his family yet. So if he tells his friends in the team, they might tell his coach. And who knows, in this scenario, the coach might be good friends with that young person's parents, and his parents might not know yet. So I think it's really important for everyone to have in their mind that, we could have the most inclusive sports across the world based in Australia. I mean, we could have every policy, we could have, million rainbow flags, welfare officers, like you name it. We could have the most inclusive environment. But I think we also need to take a step back and note that still might not be enough for a young 14-year-old that's coming to terms with their sexuality. Because there's always going to be that inherent fear, that stigma that comes with someone who's out, whether that be because of their sexuality or even the gender identity. But I also don't think that should be a deterrent for sports either, mind you. And so the flip side of that is, you're right, there are quite a substantial amount of out elite female athletes in Australia, but not necessarily out elite male athletes. In that you can probably count on one hand, in elite sport in Australia at the moment, how many there are. But I think the important thing to note for sports is that by doing more things in this space and by showing, your active work and like I said earlier, showing the proof in the pudding, showing the meat on the bones, whatever analogy you want to use, I guess proving to people that you're inclusive is so important. Otherwise, that young 14-year-old will never even pluck up the courage to tell their friends. And so if we can at least alleviate that fear there, we'll start to see a lot more people come out of the closet for sure.
And for me, what you're talking about there is behaviours of people in sports. What are they actually doing? Because you can have all those policies, like you said, but the interactions between people, the environment, the culture, I think is really important. And I'm sure you've had some really interesting conversations with some of those CEOs who are like, we've got a policy, we're inclusive.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, that's just one part of it. Back to Pride in Sport, and I think you've just had the awards.
We did, yeah. Just a couple of weeks ago, we had our annual awards night. An awesome night. Anyone who wants to join in next year, definitely get along.
Yeah, absolutely. So tell us, some of the award winners and what the night was like.
Sure. So look, anyone who's ever come to an Australian Pride and Sport Awards event, you'll know it's like it's the pinnacle really of LGBTQ inclusion in sport. And you spend an entire year doing a lot of hard work trying to create a more inclusive environment, and that's the night to really celebrate and to hear the stories of what's happening across the country. So the sporting organisation of the year for this year was Blockhouse Port Melbourne. So Blockhouse is a rock climbing / bouldering organisation. So we had quite a lot of community organisations like them recognised throughout the night. We also saw the likes of some key sports get gold tier recognition. So that's like the highest tier possible in the Pride and Sport Index. So that included Cricket Australia, Macquarie University, RMIT University Sport, and Tennis Australia. And then we also saw others like Cricket Victoria, Hockey Australia, and a whole range of others, I guess, get silver and bronze tier recognition. Look, the list goes on with how many people got amazing awards in this night, but I think for me, the most exciting part about the awards, like I've sort of said, is just hearing the stories, finding out what happens, what other people are doing in this space. Yes, Pride and Sport are one of the leaders, or one of the influencers, I should say, in this space, or at least I like to think so. But we can only do so much. A lot of the grunt work, if I can put it that way, really needs to come from the sports themselves. And so the awards night in particular is an amazing opportunity, I guess, to acknowledge and to celebrate all that amazing work that these people are doing. I quite often get asked to attend different conferences and speak, and to have sort of conversations like this. But what I wouldn't give to be able to give this platform to all the amazing people, and there's literally hundreds of them across Australian sport, which are doing fantastic stuff. But yeah, I'll be selfish and say, if you get the chance next year, come along to the Australian Pride and Sport Awards. We also have community recognition awards where people from the community can nominate. So stuff that we might not even have awareness of is an amazing opportunity for us to kind of, again, acknowledge and put those people up in front of others to find out what they're doing. But yeah, it was a brilliant night. I'm just glad that we kind of got over some of the COVID restrictions so we could have some people in the room, which was a refreshing change of pace.
Yeah, I don't think it's the same when you have those kind of awards nights on Zoom.
No, not at all.
Our teams.
The amount of people that forget to turn their microphone off mute goes crazy.
Well, congratulations on that, and I'll drop some of the award winners in the feed so people can check them out, which is really cool. And back to, I suppose, chronic diseases, and we've talked a little bit about well-being. 1 in 2 Australians have got a chronic disease, and if you could nudge the system in one way to improve the well-being of Australians, what would that be? And as a secondary question to that, is there any correlation with the LGBTQ community and chronic conditions?
What a really good question. I should preface this by saying I'm definitely not an expert in the health and wellbeing space. While I've somewhat worked in the sports / health industry for more than a decade, constantly learning new things. Look, I think if I can preface this answer by saying that when we're talking about, I guess, the health implications of the LGBTQ community more broadly, or almost any for that matter, I think it's really important that we look at things like primary prevention. So if we're talking about how can we prevent an incident happening so that we don't experience those high levels of disparities for people, whether they be marginalized communities or the general population for that matter. I think is really important to look at, and the work that we do with Pride and Sport and all the sports themselves are just one element of that. If I can dive down even a little bit further, so if we talk about, say, trans individuals, so people from the transgender and gender diverse community, those individuals in particular, we know that are massively disproportionately affected by a range of different things that will affect their health and mental well-being. And the fact that, they experience significant amount more physical and verbal attacks. They experience more bullying, more harassment, more vilification than almost anyone in our rainbow community. And I think one of the most alarming stats that I've seen over the last couple of years is one that says that 48% of young trans people in Australia have attempted suicide. Not thought about it, actually attempted to take their life. And like for me, when I heard that, it blew my mind. It was disgusting. It's sad. It's horrendous to think about. But when I bring in the conversation of primary prevention, I think this is a really good point. So if we want to improve that statistic or decrease it rather, we can do things, and we know that there are things out there that work. And one of those is what we call high levels of social support. And a specific example of that would be using a trans person's chosen name. And I think just that simple example, just by using a young trans person's chosen name, can reduce their depressive symptoms. It can reduce their suicide thoughts, and it can reduce those suicide attempts drastically, just by using their chosen name. So it's not even talking about the extra support initiatives and networks that are in place. If you use a young trans person's chosen name at work, at school, at sport, wherever, the reality is you could be saving their life. And I think for me, that you asked the point around, the chronic side of things and the disproportionate effects that people face. It's those sort of examples that I love to hear about. I don't want to say the silver lining. I can't really think of the right phrase, but it's knowing what you can do to improve those statistics is the important thing for me. And that's just one simple example. And the reality is, using a person's chosen name, using their appropriate pronouns, even for people in the queer community that identify as queer or as gay, lesbian, bi, it's making sure that we acknowledge them and respect them and, include them in every aspect of our day-to-day lives. Those sort of things are going to save people's lives, and we need to see more people doing that.
I love it when it's the simple things, isn't it? In terms of what you can do to improve people's well-being, and from what you're saying there, even save lives. That 48% it doesn't comprehend that, does it? Like, it doesn't make sense.
No.
That's a really sad statistic. So I will definitely be taking that one on board in my future work. Thank you for sharing that. And obviously, we've talked a lot about your marriage equality, stuff that you were focused on, and you've been doing a lot of work with Pride in Sport. But where do you see yourself personally in the system, and how do you contribute and influence it?
Oh God, you should have given me this question before we started. I don't know. And I say that in the nicest possible way, in that I don't know where I sit. I have no doubt that other people probably have an opinion of where I sit in this space. But look, for me, if I can just play even the smallest part of support for individuals, for sporting organizations, for different groups, to create their environment or to help them create a more inclusive and welcoming environment, then job done for me. There's always going to be work that we can do in this space. But if I can just be there to provide even the littlest amount of support, then that's my purpose. I want to be here to be able to help guide that conversation and to guide that work. Quite a lot of people refer to me as like a subject matter expert, and even the people that I work with, we sort of refer to each other as that, because we work in this space on a day-to-day basis, and we hear the stories, and we know the research, and we know the evidence and what we need to do. But like, to call myself that, I think I find that really weird, because all I've really got is my lived experience, and that's quite often a lot of the work that I do is sharing my lived experience, like what we've spoken about today. I share what happened for me and my partner living in regional areas. I share my experience during marriage equality. I quite often talk about my experience in sport and, and what that journey was like for me to come out of the closet. And even some of the, still to this day, some of the, challenges that I face as an individual. And I think I'm not the only one. I know I'm not the only one. There's so many other people that have similar, yet very unique experiences to myself. And yeah, I don't have the right answer for you, David. I'm sorry. But I just look, I'm a cog in the wheel in a way.
That answer was great, and I think you are paving the way, and that lived experience is always important, isn't it? Because telling your story is so powerful for others, and they can recognize that with maybe their own challenges, and you are a real role model for a lot of people out there, including myself. And I think it's not
Thank
easy.
you.
It's not easy to challenge the status quo.
No.
But
And I
great.
think if oh, sorry, I was just going to say, like, one other side of it is, you can never tell what the lived experience is like for people, and you can never tell what's going on in their life. And we're obviously talking quite a lot about LGBTQ inclusion in sport, but a real passion of mine, for at least the last few years, at the very least, has actually been around all ability inclusion. In that, I mentioned at the start I've got 2 kids, but what I didn't say is both of those kids are disabled, and so a lot of people don't know that and don't hear that. And I think if we can hear these stories, and if we can have more voices speak positively about what work needs to be done, even if it's just to improve the experience of people in your own life, then that's beneficial. That's better than nothing. We need to hear more people talking in this space. So I would definitely encourage anyone with a lived experience, whether it's in diversity inclusion more broadly, or something specific like being gay or trans or disabled or Indigenous or whatever it may be. We need to hear more of those stories. So.
Yeah, absolutely. Is there anything else that you'd like to add to the conversation that we've missed?
Look, we could talk for hours, David. Probably don't have that long, but look, the only sort of last sort of point I'd probably just highlight is the fact that don't wait for someone else. If you're a part of a sport, a sporting organisation, whether it's a community club, a state sporting body, a national body, whatever it may be, don't wait for someone else to take the lead on this. If this is an area that you're passionate about as an individual, start the work, start the conversations, reach out to Pride in Sport. At the very least, everyone in this country, if you're a part of a sporting organisation, should be participating in that Pride in Sport Index that you mentioned earlier. That's a free resource. It's almost, in a way, a template strategic plan or an action plan, in terms of it gives you the information of exactly what you should be doing if you want to be considered best practice in providing an inclusive environment. So check that out, participate in the index, and at the very least, start those conversations. I think that's really important. And look, even if you're not the sort of person to kind of drive a lot of the work at a particular organization, be an active ally. If that just means that you're an individual who's calling out those homophobic slurs or those transphobic innuendo or poor jokes, that's just as important. And I think it can't just be left up to the rainbow community. We need our allies, and we use the phrase active allies more than anything. Being an ally is one thing, but quite a lot of allies in Australia are actually what we consider passive, in that they're supportive, and if a plebiscite is thrust upon them, then they'll vote positively to kind of support us. But we need that active allyship. We need more people to speak out against these homophobic, biphobic, and transphobic experiences that people are still facing in sport today. So that would be my final elevator pitch, if you will.
No, I agree. I think it's everybody's responsibility, and to have that courage, and we accept what we tolerate, right? So if you hear a conversation going on and it can be derogatory, then it's about calling it out, isn't it? And so I am going to ask you one more question, just because I've got you, and I'm enjoying the chat. In terms of where Australia sits internationally. So we've got, Pride in Sport over here. Are there similar organisations to that that are doing some really good work, and where are they? And where does Australia sit in terms of not a league table, but how we're going?
Yeah, no, that's well. It's sport. It's inherently competitive, isn't it? So it's only understandable. Look, that's a really good question. So to answer one of your questions around, who else is there around the world? North America, so in Canada and America, the UK and New Zealand in particular, those countries have, networks or groups sort of similar to Pride in Sport. There's a group in the UK that's called Pride Sport UK. So our names are really similar. You've probably heard of them. There's You Can Play over in North America. And there's plenty more out there. I think at this point in time, it's really difficult to try and compare internationally, like to compare where Australia sits against other other countries. But I'm going to give you an answer, and it's going to be biased because I'm Australian. But we're definitely leading the way. And I that's probably come across as a bit of a joke, but I genuinely think that at least to a degree, in that, you look at some of the things that we've done, not just Pride in Sport, but other organisations like Proud to Play, Pride Cup, Play by the Rules. There's so much work that's happened in Australia over the last few years. And I think there's an element of that which, has come about by whether it's key leaders in this space or, the sport's actually wanting to do more. And I'm happy to be proven wrong, but I probably just haven't seen that same level of collaboration or collective approach to LGBTQ inclusion that Australia has compared to other countries. So I think Australia is probably leading the way, maybe slightly there. But it's really difficult to give that international comparison. I think if I can give you one small comparison, though, is if we look at it from a domestic level, if you want to compare the sporting industry in Australia and the workforce, I can 100% tell you that the sporting industry in Australia is between 5 and 10 years behind the corporate world. So we've got a long way to go. And a lot of people think that that's like astonishing and it's crazy. And I base that off quite a lot of the research and information that comes out of not only the Pride in Sport Index, so what the results tell us in that space, but the equivalent for workforce, so the Australian Workplace Equality Index. So both of those benchmarking instruments are evidence-based, so it requires the organisations to prove what they're doing in this area. And we can tell, and I did this bit of a study about 2 years ago, and it's anywhere between 5 and 10 years behind the workforce in Australia. Having said that, though, it's not all doom and gloom. We know that it's not going to take us 10 years to catch up to the workforce, the corporate world in Australia. In actual fact, if we look at some of the award winners of the Pride and Sport Awards this year, there was a handful of them on there, one in particular, which was Macquarie University Sport, which have just come leaps and bounds in the last 18 months of pretty much starting to work in this space, in that now they're one of the national leaders in inclusion work. And they've only really been doing this work more hands-on in the last 2 years. It's scary to know that we're that far behind the corporate world, but it's not going to take us that long to catch up.
Well, it's great to hear where Australia is at internationally, even if you've got a little bit of bias in there. And but
definitely a little bit of bias.
I was it was interesting to see that gap between employment really, in the corporate world and sport. But like you said, hopefully it won't take us 5 to 10 years to catch up. So. Okay, well, I've loved chatting with you, Beau. Awesome to speak to you as always. I'm sure I'll see you at a conference soon where you'll be up there doing what you do. But thank you for all the work that you do, and just keep doing it. And I'll catch up with you soon.
Thank you so much, David. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk to you. And like I said, anyone who watches this back, if you want to reach out to us, visit our website, prideandsport.com.au. I have no doubt David will share all the links. If he wasn't going to, he's going to now.
I've got no choice now. Absolutely.
Yeah. But no, I really appreciate it, David. And yeah, look, the more conversations we can hear like this, the better. So thank you very much. I genuinely appreciate it.
Yeah, no worries. And from one man from Newcastle in the UK to another man who's sitting in Newcastle in Australia, I'll see you soon.
Awesome. Thanks, David.
See ya. Bye.